Yuma everyone, and welcome to the Human Rights Commission's annual Human Rights Day Forum. I'm Penny Mathew and I'm the President and Human Rights Commissioner here in the ACT, and I'm delighted to be emceeing this event. It's devoted to the very important topic of the right to housing. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people as traditional custodians of the land we're meeting on, and recognise other people and families with connections to the lands of the ACT and region. I wish to acknowledge their continuing culture and the contribution they make to the life of this city and the region. I'd also like to acknowledge other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are participating in today's event. I also acknowledge the many VIPs who are joining us today, in addition to a very high quality lineup of speakers. We have a number of politicians in the room. We also have some VIPs who couldn't attend. I know Minister Tara Chain would have loved to have been here in her capacity as both Human Rights Minister and the Attorney General, but she had a clash, as did the Minister for Homes and New Suburbs, Yvette Berry. But confirmed attendees include Peter Kane, who is Shadow Attorney General and also responsible for housing services, Greens MLAs Shane Rattenbury, Laura Nuttall and Joe Clay, and I think I've also seen at least one of the independents, Tom Emerson, and we might have Fiona Carrick with us as well today. And I think we're also expecting Senator David Pocock. Thank you to your staff and to you for attending today. There's another long list of VIPs from the community and government. I'm not going to acknowledge all of them, but I would like to say hello to the former Chief Minister John Stanhope. Thank you for being here. And my predecessor, Helen Watchers. Thank you for being here. I'd also like to thank our Auslan interpreters, Chevoy and Sean, who are assisting us today. Today, the 10th of December, is the day we celebrate the adoption of the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights. It is also, this year, the 20th anniversary of the ACT's Human Rights Act. The Human Rights Act was a groundbreaking move to bring home the rights set out in international treaties to which Australia is a party. Over time, the Act has evolved significantly with the inclusion of obligations on public authorities, a complaints handling function for the Human Rights Commission, and the addition of more rights, including the new right to a healthy environment, and that comes into force in March next year. Despite these significant developments, key socio-economic rights are still missing from our Act. And today we're going to be talking about one of these, the right to housing. This right is recognised in many international treaties to which Australia is party, the primary one being the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. Article 11 of this treaty provides for the right to an adequate standard of living, which includes adequate food, clothing and housing. Today we'll talk about what this right to housing means, who is missing out, what that's like for people, what investments need to be made going forward, and what a right to housing in the ACT Human Rights Act might deliver for people. Now, before we begin, I'm delighted to acknowledge Selina Walker, who is going to give us the Welcome to Country. Welcome to Country is always an important ceremonial part of proceedings, but I think it's particularly important when we're talking about the right to a home. Now, Selina, I'm sure, is very well known to everyone here. She's a Ngunnawal elder and the 2024 ACT Local Hero. She's worked tirelessly for Aboriginal families and children, especially kids in out-of-home care, as well as for First Nations people within the criminal justice system. She's also worked tirelessly for reconciliation, remarking that post-referendum, reconciliation is still alive, despite the setback of the no vote. I'm very pleased to hand over to Selina Walker to welcome us. Thank you, Selina.
Thank you. Yuma, Galganya Jelena Walker, Dhurrawang Ngunnawal. Hello, my name is Selina Walker and this is Ngunnawal country. I just want to first start by acknowledging my elders, the Ngunnawal elders, and pay respect to my elders past, present and future. I'd also like to acknowledge the recent passing of my grandmother, Auntie Agnes Shea, who was the most senior Ngunnawal elder here. I'd also like to acknowledge any other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that are with us here and acknowledge your tribal groups. Welcome my brothers, sisters, aunts and uncles, and I'd like to extend that to all of our non-Indigenous friends that have joined us. Welcome. The Ngunnawal community are the traditional custodians of Canberra and the region. You may not be aware that the Ngunnawal nation is made up of several family groups and not just individuals who represent this country. Therefore, as a community, we have an elected body known as the United Ngunnawal Elders Council to represent us, along with the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander elected body of the ACT. This is important for you to understand and acknowledge, for our identity is a collective identity. There are other Indigenous and non-Indigenous people from around the nation, the country and the world who've come to live on Ngunnawal land. I'd like to acknowledge and welcome you all. The tradition of working the people of country is a practice that was handed down by our ancestors, old people and elders from the beginning of time. Before entering another person's country, you would first announce your arrival and not enter until the traditional owner formally welcomed you. The reason for this practice was to protect your spirit whilst in another person's country and also to show respect for the country of which you were entering. It's wonderful to see this practice is now recognised and respected. I suppose it's not like entering into someone's home unless you're first invited. The Ngunnawal people, as within all Aboriginal people, have a great heritage that we would like to share with all Australians from every walk of life. As you are aware, Canberra means meeting place, and Canberra has been a place of gathering for many Aboriginal tribes of Australia to come together to deal with important business and also for ceremonial purposes. Our Ngunnawal ancestors believe in the importance of people gathering to build relationships, share knowledge and to celebrate the gift of heritage and history. We believe it's important for all to recognise our unique history and to gain an understanding that our land is our heritage and how loss of the lands has disconnected so many Aboriginal people from their spiritual links, cultural heritage and identity. Reconciliation is not just a word, it is an action, and it's a human rights movement. As an Aboriginal person in this country, I've only been counted as a human being for 57 years. Let me repeat this while this sinks in. I, as a beautiful black woman in Australia, have only been counted as a human being for 57 years. I'm only 43. We're very young in our reconciliation journey here in Australia, but we're on the right path. By incorporating proper cultural protocols like welcome to country, acknowledgement of country, smoking ceremonies, etc., we are on the road to true reconciliation. It does hurt me though that my dad was born a tree, that my grandmother was a mother in this country before she was a human being. So I ask you all to take a moment and think about how old you are, how old your elders are, and how old your children are, and what you're doing to contribute to that reconciliation human rights movement. The referendum that happened last year was another huge milestone in our reconciliation journey. Not the result that we wanted, but it did bring a lot of truth-telling. Helped us to identify where we have to focus our efforts and what states need the most amount of help. I'm so proud to be a Canberran. I'm proud of my fellow Canberrans for the yes vote here in the ACT. Still a lot of work to be done, but it's a demonstration that the work that my grandmother and many other elders have done towards reconciliation can influence that change that we all want. Remembering that that vote was not a vote for me to be Aboriginal, it was not a vote for me to be a traditional owner, it was a vote to edit a document, and that's what Australia said no to. So we'll recalibrate, we'll reassess, we'll find another way forward to continue to fight for First Nations justice. I stand on the shoulders of giants and I want to honour those giants. Every time I mention the word referendum or vote, I see people get fidgety and uncomfortable. We've got to stop this. It is a shared history, so there has to be shared accountability. If we continue to live in shame here in Australia, we are never going to progress forward. I don't want my boys to be standing up here in 20, 30 years' time, fighting and advocating for the same things that I am today, that my grandmother's done for the past 60 years and my ancestors for the past 200 years. That change happens with us. So I encourage you all to continue to have those conversations, have those awkward discussions where learning and understanding, which is what true reconciliation actually is, lies. It lies in a simple yarn. For those that knew my grandmother, probably would hear that my welcome to country is very, very familiar. I have been saying that same welcome to country for about 10 years now. And yet those key fundamentals, my grandmother taught me to do that, still are not understood here. We still have a lot of work to be done. But I will continue to say it until we get there. Equally with accommodation and, absolutely acknowledging that our land is our heritage and sovereignty was never ceded, so it always will and always was and always will be Aboriginal land. The fundamentals need to be done first. I recently went up to Sydney with a company called Amplify to work on accommodation and learnt much more than I've ever did. There was 2 experts there and the conversation was around accommodation, how we fix the housing crisis here. I'm not going to say that I learnt a lot more. In fact, it brought up more questions than it did answers. But the one thing that I do know about accommodation is that it is the foundation. It is the key to success for every single human being. Human being, not race, not religion. So we need to do better. We need to fix this crisis because without that foundation, what success and what future do we have? We are the ones, the change makers here. There's absolutely always a solution, there's always a choice. So I look forward to hearing the conversations and working towards, a better future with accommodation that works for everybody. So thank you for inviting me here to Welcome to Country. I'll finish in the words of my people and then we'll get listening to the experts. But I will say this, you will not remember me today for the words that I have said, you will remember me for how I made you feel. We are humans, it is our emotions that make us humans, it's our emotions that create long-term memories. That's where the change lies. In what you're feeling now, that's what we need to progress forward. So, Yumalandi Yunanga Yerebu Yangu, which means you may leave footprints on our land now, or in other words, welcome to country. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Selina, for your warm welcome to country, and we accept your invitation to leave footprints on the home of the Ngunnawal people. And we resolve to keep the rights of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community in the forefront of our minds as we discuss this important right to housing. I'm now going to introduce the speakers on our panel before I invite one of them to come to the podium and kick off with 5 or 6 minutes of an opening speech. So, on the far end of the panel, we have Professor Kevin Bell. The Honourable Kevin Bell AO-KC describes himself as a baby boomer who grew up in social housing in the Melbourne suburb of Moorabbin. And fittingly, as he notes, in the language of the Boonwurrung, Moorabbin means resting place or mother's milk. Kevin graduated in Arts and Law from Monash University and worked at the Tenants' Union of Victoria before practising as a barrister for 20 years, including in Victorian housing and residential tenancies law. As a judge of the Supreme Court of Victoria for 15 years, he wrote many influential judgments on human rights, including the right to housing and a home. As a professor in the Faculty of Law at Monash University and director of the Custodian Centre for Human Rights Law, he's similarly focused on housing, homelessness and human rights. He also served as a commissioner of the Uruk Justice Commission and has a Master's in International Human Rights Law from Oxford University. He's presently an adjunct professor at Monash and the patron of Tenants Victoria. Please welcome Professor Kevin Bell. We also have star lineup, Genevieve Bolton. So Genevieve's sitting right next to Kevin at the end there. She's the Executive Director and Principal Solicitor of Canberra Community Law, a position she's held since 2010. Genevieve has practised in homelessness and social housing since 2003. Under Genevieve's leadership, Canberra Community Law has significantly expanded its focus on assisting individuals and families with social housing issues through the establishment of new services, including street law and the ACAT Duty Lawyer Service. ACAT, of course, is the Civil and Administrative Tribunal here in the ACT. New multidisciplinary service models have also been implemented, including introducing a socio-legal practice model in the ACT a decade ago. This involves a lawyer and an in-house social worker working together to provide intensive legal and social support to help clients realise their housing rights. In her capacity as Chair of Economic Justice Australia, and I think she's just recently stepped down from that significant role, Genevieve secured funding for Homeward Bound, a major research report published in 2020, which explored the intersection between social security, the social housing system and homelessness. In 2015, Genevieve was awarded the Australian Human Rights Commission Law Award for her work promoting and advancing human rights through the practice of law. She was awarded a Medal of the Order of Australia in 2016, so please a round of applause for Genevieve as well. Next, right in the middle, we have Dr. Devin Bowles. Devin is the CEO of the ACT Council of Social Services, or ACTCOSS. He previously held senior leadership roles in the community sector and government. As an epidemiologist and social scientist with extensive scholarly and other publications, Devin has taught at the ANU Medical School and the University of Canberra, and he remains a visiting fellow at the Health Research Institute at UC. ACTCOSS has, of course, been very active in the area of housing and advocacy for it, and we're going to ask Devin to talk a little bit about the election campaign that he put together with ACT Shelter. So please welcome Devin Bowles. Next, they must have sat in the order on which I had the introductions. We've got Rachael Clark. So Rachael is a supervising solicitor in the Dhurrawang Aboriginal Human Rights Program at Canberra Community Law. Rachael is a proud Wiradjuri woman from the Murrumbidgee on her mother's side who has lived and worked on Ngunnawal country for most of her adult life. Rachael enjoys working in an Aboriginal-led legal team and has a passion for social justice with specific interests in human rights and administrative law, including housing law and social security law. Rachael had a wide range of work experience in other fields before coming to the law later in life. So before working as a community lawyer, Rachael worked at the University of Canberra in student advocacy and has undertaken mentorships at the ACCC and the ACT Supreme Court. Rachael is currently a member of the ACT First Nations Legal Network, the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Women's Alliance, and Australia's Community Law Centre's Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Women's Network. Please welcome Rachael Clark. And finally, we have Kellie Jones, and I'm going to ask Kellie to come to the podium in a few minutes. Kellie works in office management and accounting and has lived in Canberra since 2020. While Kellie describes her life in very settled terms now, and we had a lovely dinner last night where we were sharing stories about our upbringing, and she describes a sense of well-being, a partner of 22 years, Simon, who's in the room with us today, and 2 adult children, she experienced homelessness earlier in her life. Kellie's a volunteer with OrangeSky, and you may have heard about her story through the media. There was a piece in the Canberra Times just recently. At the age of 18, Kellie experienced living rough in her car for several months. As she describes it, a complex yet common combination of mental health issues, substance abuse and family unit breakdown. She moved from homelessness into a relationship with an abusive man for 6 years, and she notes she was an easy target for a man like him due to her vulnerability and young age. She escaped that life with her 5-month-old daughter, but says she's been more fortunate than many victims of domestic violence today who are living in their cars with their children. Kellie volunteers for OrangeSky, which I'm sure most of our audience will be familiar with. It's a charity offering laundry, showers and conversations for people experiencing homelessness. And she says she looks for small ways to make a big difference in the daily life of someone living rough, being a strong believer in immediate solutions to immediate problems. Please welcome Kellie Jones. And Kellie, I'm going to ask you at this point to come up to the podium and just get the proceedings started for us.
Thank you, Dr. Mathew. Low life, bum, loser, good for nothing. I once believed all of that judgment thrown my way. I've experienced mental health issues since childhood, which led to substance abuse at a very, very early age. A breakdown of my family unit at the age of 10 compounded both issues. I was inevitably out on my own, while still completing high school and then tertiary studies in accounting. I don't know how, but I held down a job delivering pizzas for some time, but as the substance abuse escalated, I lost my job. I could no longer afford rent and found myself living in my car for several months. The two emotions that stayed with me, even from 30 years ago, are loneliness and uncertainty. Of course my substance abuse escalated. What better way to forget the dire circumstances I was in? The shame and embarrassment disappeared the more I checked out. That cycle is not particular to my story. It is a brutal common theme for those living rough. My life changed dramatically when I was taken in by a man in his 30s who turned out to become my abuser for the next 6 years. In the 90s, I escaped him with my 5-month-old daughter under my arm, and I was blessed to have the support of Centrelink, a sympathetic real estate agent as well, rare, and some family members with whom I had reconnected. My face is not the general face of a domestic violence victim of today. There's a growing number of our fellow Australians living rough with parents with children, living in their cars, escaping the wrath of an abuser. How does a parent on a single income, possibly just from Centrelink, afford a place to rent? From where do they obtain rental referees when their abuser controlled all the money? Two things that often accompany domestic violence is mental illness and substance abuse. Again, it is clear how these two issues play such an underlining role in homelessness in Australia. Haven't enough decades passed to label this a systemic problem? Children have been raised in poverty and rough living conditions for too many years of inaction. What happened to Bob Hawke's famous promise by 1990? Follow-up services have been absent for these children. They are now adults and they struggle to function in society against all odds. Another new and unfortunate face to see living rough is the middle-aged single woman. A woman who was once married and has gone through a divorce. She is too young for the pension and too underskilled or in poor health to work. She is unskilled because she spent her life up until now as a homemaker. Her choices are either living in shared accommodation with strangers or in a car if she's lucky enough to own one. My own mum was nearly one of these women. As the property values grew over the past few decades, rents followed suit. And every time the unit she rented was bought and sold, rent would go up $10 a week, over and over. Eventually, she found herself with only $30 a fortnight for food. Fortunately, though, for my mum, my sister and I were in a position to buy her a small unit to live in. That's uncommon. It's just not happening. I am 9 years sober now. Yes, it has been a long road to gain control of my mental health and substance abuse. My partner of 22 years has supported me through some very dark days, and a lesser man would have left me. During these years of clarity, I now always look for ways to provide a here and now difference to the day of a person living rough. I volunteer and raise funds for OrangeSky, who provides laundry services and friendly, non-judgmental conversations and positive community connections. I'll finish today with one request, which I'll urge you all to start. When you see someone doing it rough, ask them their name, because often that is all they now own. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kellie. You've given us a lot to think about, and I'm looking forward to getting into some Q&A with all of our panellists. I'm going to throw to Kevin first. Kevin's written a very readable book. See, it's only a little one on the right, Housing the Great Australian Right, it's called. So, Kevin, you've written this lovely book. Tell us, what does the right to housing entail? Do we all have the right to own a 3-bedroom house on a quarter-acre block?
No, we don't have that, but we all do have a right to housing of some form that is adequate. That might be that kind of home, or it might be an apartment or flat. It might be a rented accommodation. It may be necessary emergency accommodation. I want to pay tribute to Kellie's bravery in describing her personal story. Thank you for sharing that with us. I don't underestimate the difficulty of doing that in this setting, and I thank you for your bravery. And I just record how important housing ultimately was to Kellie's recovery, and how significant it is that she's here talking about that today. Her story really is something of a human rights success story, because she's been able to obtain that which she most needed, having regard to her personal circumstances, which is the right to housing. It's not a right in Australian domestic law yet. It is an international law right. It's wonderful to be saying that today, because this is Human Rights Day, the day on which the UDHR was made by the General Assembly of the United Nations. It's included in there. It came to be included in the 2 covenants, which are the foundation of international human rights law, to which Australia is a party. The right to adequate housing has several components. Adequacy is the key. It needs to be secure. It needs to be physically appropriate. It needs to be that place where somebody can live alone or with family, in society, in peace, in dignity and in security. The right might amount to a right to social housing, because it's difficult, as we all know in the current circumstances, for everybody to access housing through the private market. So a significant public housing sector is indispensable for the right to housing to be realised, even in a relatively wealthy country like Australia. One aspect of the right to housing is the right to be free from arbitrary interference with one's home, which is an element of that part of the right that I called the right to secure housing. It encompasses residential tenancy as a form of housing. So the right to housing is tenure neutral, as it were. We tend to think of housing in this country more as something owned, but in other countries the mix is much more diverse, and being an international law right, it applies across the board in all countries to capture that form of housing. Because it does apply to residential tenancy, it is necessary, as is being increasingly realised in this country, for it to be secure. Therefore, eviction without cause is completely contrary to the idea of the right to housing in respect of residential tenancies. And I think the ACT moved on this a while ago, Victoria more recently, and New South Wales, it has been announced, is moving in that direction now. I just want to say 2 more things, if I may. The first thing is that the right to housing is universal, so it belongs to everybody. There can be no question of anybody being left behind. There can be no question of just doing better so that a few more people have the right to housing in a country like Australia where it is not being realised, because everybody has that right. And it involves, secondly, state responsibility to make sure that that right is implemented with respect to everybody. That means that government can't just say it is doing better than some previous impoverished age when the right was left behind. It has to be realised with respect to everybody, albeit progressively. I think that's enough. Thank you.
Excellent. And I'm sure there'll be follow-up questions from the audience when we get to that part of the proceedings. Thank you for the very succinct explanation of what the right to housing involves. So Kellie, I'm going to come back to you again. You've shared your story about how you became homeless. So what in your experience leads to homelessness, and what do young people miss out on when they're homeless?
So there's a multitude of reasons for homelessness. Mental health, illness, substance abuse, which I will say is often just a symptom of mental health illness. There's domestic violence, family breakdown. The pandemic, may we forget. And number 5, of course, is the cost of living crisis. These reasons are often precursors to substance abuse and therefore make it difficult not to judge homeless people as unstable, unreliable addicts. But these issues do not define them. They just lack the safe, grounding space to belong and call home, which would lead to well-being, stability and healing. We cannot underestimate the value of a stable home base with basic essentials. So young people living in poverty and homelessness face pressures beyond their years. Just last night I've received my latest OrangeSky newsletter for volunteers, and blasting out at me on my computer, almost 40% of people who are homeless in Australia right now are under 24 years old. 40%. Up to 1 in 6 children experience poverty. Now, we're one of the wealthiest countries in Australia, in the world, aren't we? Yep, okay. So being homeless is exhausting, and I recall being asked, what did I do all day? Well, it takes a lot of nervous energy and time in a day to find things as basic as food, a safe place to sleep for the next night, and maintain a certain level of personal hygiene if possible. Harder back when I was homeless, because I certainly didn't have OrangeSky to help me out. But, I mean, what happens to the schooling of these young people? Their socialisation with peers, and where's their exposure to a proper routine, or worse, their exposure to inappropriate situations? And the follow on from that, where's their prospects of employment? Run-ins with the law will be possibly increased, and there's so much missed out on, and instead it's just filled with negative experiences. Lots missed out on.
So Kellie, you talked there about factors about the individual, and of course there are big picture structural things that are going on here. So, you know, I mean, people like Kevin have referred to it as a disaster, the situation of housing. And Devin, when we were going through the ACT election, ACTCOSS and ACT Shelter put together a platform for the election talking about some of those bigger kind of structural issues. So what reforms and investments were you recommending in that platform, and why?
Thanks very much. And I might answer that by taking the invitation and the beautiful welcome to country to remember fundamentals and remember history. And I think one really important thing to note when most Australians think about rights, the way that we think about them was really shaped by 18th century thinkers in France and Britain and the American colonies. And it's worth noting that these were mostly rich or upper middle class white men, meaning they were really privileged. And I note that because I think it shapes the way that we think about rights in some fundamental ways. First, rights were conceptualized by them as things that they already had that they wanted not to be taken away. So it was coming from a position of strength and concern about someone taking something away. And the other thing to note is that in that context, the only real force that they had to worry about was government. And so you look at, for instance, the US Bill of Rights, and it is a list of things that the founding fathers didn't want government to take away from them. Guns, the ability to congregate, the ability to practice the religion they wanted. At around the same point in history, corporations were gaining in strength quite a bit. And so in India, India was being colonized in the 18th century, not by the crown of Britain, but by a corporation, the East India Company. And I suspect if our intellectual tradition came more from having been colonized by a company, we might see a second set of threats to our rights from corporations. I think we're just starting to twig to this now in Western society. And I think further, we might see the threat to our interests from markets, especially when they are not sufficiently regulated. So I guess the take home from this little trip through history is that, one, rights aren't necessarily just things that can be taken away from you. They are things that maybe need to be supplied. But also that government, the relationship between government and rights is not just that it might take something away. So the platform that ACTCOSS and Shelter put together for housing for the most recent ACT election really focuses on how the market fails and what we need to do to fix that. So the first ask, biggest ask in many respects, is to stop the slide in the proportion of all housing, which is social housing. We know that the market, from international evidence and even the ACT's history, when left to its own devices, doesn't result in everyone being housed. And intuitively, I think this probably makes sense to most people. When you have someone on income support payments making $370 a week and specialist medical practitioners billing more than that an hour, the market's not going to be able to solve their issues in the same way. Our second thing or element of our platform was around protecting renters' rights. And I think particularly because the market is so skewed in favor of landlords right now because of the overall housing shortage, renters need particular rights. And the ACT government has absolutely made strides in that direction, but we think there are more steps to take. Much of the rest of our platform looked at priority populations who we know the market and history have disadvantaged. So it includes people with mental health issues, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and people with disabilities. We also know that we need to fund homelessness services because the market and the supports that we have in place are failing. And finally, we called for an amendment to the ACT Human Rights Act for housing to be included in that.
Thanks very much, Devin. And we're pretty early days with our new government. Do you like the direction of travel, or is it just too early to make any calls on that?
So there has, in a supply and confidence agreement between Mr. Emerson and Labor, there is a commitment to increase the proportion of all housing, which is community and public housing. If we can make good on that, that will certainly be a step in the right direction. ACTCOSS's own platform called for a return to 10% by 2036. This is going back in the ACT's history a few decades, but it really the ACT's history that demonstrates that this figure is absolutely achievable. So much will depend on the speed that we arrest the decline and how rapidly we are able to build the proportion of housing which is community and public housing to make up for where we know the market fails.
Great, thank you. I'm going to turn to Genevieve now. So at Canberra Community Law, you represent clients in housing matters. What are the sorts of issues you're seeing in your legal practice, and what assistance are you able to give your clients?
Thank you. Can you hear me? Canberra Community...
I think you just need to hold it right up like a...
Oh, sorry. Canberra Community Law is the only free legal service in the ACT which specialises in public housing law and homelessness. We recently celebrated our 40th birthday, and from the day that the centre was opened up until now, assisting social housing tenants, community housing tenants has been at the heart of the work that we have done over those decades. We also assist occupants, that is people living in caravan parks, refuges and other crisis accommodation. Despite the progressive reform in recent years, we still have a situation where occupants have very limited rights, and despite the fact that they could be living in their accommodation for many, many years, they can be evicted without the grantor, the housing provider, having to go to the ACT Civil and Administrative Tribunal. So there's still significant work that needs to be done in addressing the rights of people who are in rental accommodation in the ACT. We advocate alongside our clients to prevent people from being evicted from social housing, for people to be housed, and also for appropriate and safe housing conditions. We see a wide range of issues that our clients are facing, but just to give you some idea of some of the most common issues we see. We assist on a regular basis people who are seeking reassessment of their placement on the social housing waiting list. For example, in situations where people are experiencing overcrowding, the aggravation of mental and physical health conditions due to inadequate housing, and emotional and financial distress. I had a look on that Housing ACT website this morning to have a look at the average waiting times that people wait in the ACT to be housed. And in the case of the most urgent priority housing list, you would be waiting on average 196 days. And in fact, in our experience, depending on the type of housing you need, that could be much, much longer than what is already a long period of 196 days. We see the situation in the ACT in order to access public housing is incredibly difficult to navigate. And as a result of that, we see people come to us having spent years and years and years languishing on often the standard housing list. In our experience, if you're on the standard housing list, you probably would never be housed in social public housing in the ACT. So an example of some of the examples to provide to speak to the experience of our clients. One that I recall is George, not his real name. He was a refugee who recently became a permanent resident. He speaks limited English. He's a good example of someone who had been languishing on the standard housing list for many, many years. He could not afford private rent and was facing living in a car when he was temporarily taken in by friends. It was very clear that he met the priority housing criteria. He was homeless. He was facing homelessness. He had formally diagnosed mental health conditions, trauma, chronic physical health and disability, which were extremely detrimental to his well-being. He also expressed daily thoughts of ending his life due to chronic pain, a lack of hope for the future, and extreme cultural shame surrounding his circumstances. We were able to assist him by collecting support letters from a number of medical and health practitioners and other community organisations who were assisting him. And we made priority submissions to Housing ACT. His matter was approved to the most urgent list within a month, and within a matter of weeks he was housed in a brand new ground floor unit in Canberra. We also assist people facing eviction after experiencing, for example, domestic violence and financial abuse, a physical or mental health crisis, a relapse of substance use disorder, losing their job and having their centre payments cut off. We regularly represent social housing tenants facing eviction before the ACT Civil and Administrative Tribunal. For example, we assisted Casey, again not their real name, who was a Housing ACT tenant, which was referred to us after the tribunal had ordered their eviction into homelessness. Casey was an Aboriginal person who had experienced childhood trauma, depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation and discrimination from neighbours at their Housing ACT property. Casey is also kinship carer for their younger family members. Casey had difficulty engaging with external services or formal proceedings due to their mental health. Casey had been without income for several months as her mental health had prevented them from fulfilling reporting obligations for their social security income. We successfully assisted Casey to apply to ACAT to set aside the eviction order and return the matter to the list for hearing. We also liaised with Centrelink, another core area of our practice, to assist Casey to reinstate regular social security payments. We supported Casey to engage with culturally appropriate services, including health services for mental health support. We assisted Casey at the tribunal hearing to defend their tenancy based on human rights, including their distinct cultural rights as a First Nations person. And we were successful in advocating for Casey, and the tribunal made a payment order which enabled Casey to stay in their home. Another significant area where people contact for us for assistance is in relation to serious property condition issues that are causing health problems. So every single day people contact us who are in properties which are in extremely poor condition, that have inadequate heating and cooling, extensive mould infestation, non-functioning kitchens and bathrooms, and a lack of insulation and ventilation. From our perspective, the ACT housing and homelessness crisis is clearly having a disproportionate impact on overburdened communities. The ACT Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community, people with disabilities, including complex mental health issues, women experiencing family and domestic violence, asylum seekers with no income, and people exiting institutions. As a result of that, we have designed and established a number of specialist programs to try and meet these needs and assist people to realise their right to adequate and safe housing.
Thanks, Genevieve, and thanks for doing a fabulous job. Kellie, I might just throw to you before coming back to Rachael. So we're talking here mainly about legal services. Was there a service in particular that helped you or that you were able to access?
No. Let's say 30 years ago, so yeah, giving away the age. But look, other than a handful of friends who still lived with their parents, given the age I was at 18, 19, they still lived with mum and dad. I would get a meal, I'd get a shower occasionally, but being a substance user was not conducive to gaining trust from parents of friends. So, as I've already said, I ended up just finding a home with a man in his 30s, and he became my abuser then. So, I just wanted to quickly the stories Genevieve has brought up with my work with OrangeSky, particularly on the refugee immigrant front. We have friends who come and use our services, and I think this gets forgotten. They're fed a line overseas from back home, be it in Iran, Afghanistan, wherever they've come from. They're fed lines about Australia, and they get here and there's nothing here for them. What is that? What is that? That's shameful. Shameful.
I'd endorse that in my personal capacity as a refugee lawyer. I don't get to deal with these issues perhaps very much in my current role in the ACT. It's a federal issue, and it's about the kinds of policy settings we have at the federal level for treatment of refugees and asylum seekers in particular. I'm going to turn to Rachael now. So one of the targets in the National Agreement on Closing the Gap, Target 9, is that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people can secure appropriate affordable housing that's aligned with their priorities and need. And of course, housing can then impact on many of the other targets in the Closing the Gap agreement as well, and of course, more generally, human rights. What housing gaps and issues do you see in your work with Aboriginal clients?
Well, the National Agreement on Closing the Gap includes 17 target areas which impact on the lives and outcomes for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. We would say that a home is the basis of your life, where you're able to have stability, a place to rest and grow and form connections and heal. So without that place, we would say that the lack of access to suitable and affordable housing impacts on all the other target areas. By most standards, the current situation, from housing to jobs to health, I would say are at unacceptable levels. I know that data has been collected on some of these areas by the Productivity Commission, but not all. But my personal view is that it's not possible to reach those targets by 2031. I keep threatening in my small legal career to my colleagues to write a paper, and I'd call it Replication Nation. Coming from the private sector and my own personal experiences, I have learned that through the change of government and people, that there seems to be a replication of the work that has already been done and problems that already have been solved. And the results remain the same. Things don't change. The old problems still exist. And so I would urge any leaders or people who have power to go and dust off the old reports and have a look at them, because the answers are most likely there. In the ACT, there are the traditional custodians, the Ngunnawal people, and of course other people and connections who have connections to these lands, but also there's many other people who come here to the ACT to find work and call it a home and form their own connections with this land. And of those people, many of us are very grateful that we can come here and do the work that we do. The ACT's population is in March, is about 28,000 people shy of being 500,000 people. In the ACT, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population is approximately 9,000 people, so a small percentage of the population. Within that 9,000 people, many are working, are self-sustaining and doing everything like everyone else in the community. Like every community, there is a percentage of people that are vulnerable, who are sick and unwell, who are carers, who are looking after children. And our team at Canberra Community Law is mainly working with those people. We offer a wraparound service to our countrymen, our brothers and sisters who are having issues with housing and Centrelink issues and all range of issues, because sadly there aren't enough legal services and access to justice is very hard to obtain. Coming here, I've written a list which, if you haven't already guessed, I'm happy to take an opportunity for a rant if I can get one and stand on my soapbox. But we would always welcome an opportunity to talk about the work we do in a hope that it can evolve into change. So I've written a list because I think all of these issues need to be raised, and I don't want to forget any of them. In our community, in the ACT, the issues are largely replicated by the ones that Genevieve has already talked about, and then there are more. So I'm going to go through that list. But first of all, because Canberra is an abundant and prosperous city, the large homeless population and the difficulties are almost unseen. Then there is the severe shortage of housing where demand exceeds supply, which we brought to the attention of the government in 2019, but was largely unknown by the public until, of course, it hit the private sector, and now it's a national problem. Inside the shortage of housing, we see an absence of appropriately sized properties. We see people who are seeking to be housed in locations which are not safe for them and are far from their connections and supports, including people escaping family violence who are accepting properties who are in a very poor state of repair, believing that they'll soon be relocated, but are not, and are often left to stay in those properties for years and years. For some time, we've been providing assistance to people who are living in properties which are in an appalling state of repair. For those in the legal community, perhaps would be aware of, I think it's the first case ever to reach the High Court of Young, which discusses properties owned by the Northern Territory Government in remote communities where repairs were not undertaken in a reasonable timeframe. Those issues are not just in the Northern Territory, they are here in the ACT. We have provided assistance to mothers who have been without heating and cooking facilities for not days or weeks, but years. We see people who are exhausted from being caught in a system of trying to have their property repairs undertaken, and who are told that there's no record of their request for a repair in the system, even though many people have visited their property and undertaken inspections and made reports about the poor condition of properties. We're seeing a steep rise in high-density housing into complexes which are largely unmanaged and therefore are becoming unsafe. Families who are caring for children under sometimes kinship care arrangements don't have access to adequately sized properties. People who are unable to leave prison and are denied parole because they don't have a safe housing option. As of 2023, the ACT government reports that the cost to keeping someone in the AMC is $543.19 per day. My colleague informed me that for a child, for a day, that price rose to $3,619 per day. Then those same people who have remained in prison because there's no safe housing option for them are then exited into homelessness, or worse still, into supported accommodation, which is akin to a civil prison when they're locked in their bedroom at night. I've collected some stories from some of the lawyers in our team and taken some quotes from some of our clients. And I'll share those with you very quickly. One of our clients who came here from the bush had to accept a unit which had no yard. She just wants to be able to put her feet in the grass at home. Some of my clients feel judged, firstly because they're Aboriginal, and then because of that they are treated differently, and it is proposed that their standards of living are less. Of a mother whose power to her home kept cutting out. They wouldn't listen to me. I called so many times to get help, and someone would come out and do the work, and then the problem would happen again. There are young people who are concerned about not being able to fulfil their cultural obligations because they're unable to access a property with another bedroom to enable them to care for their elders. There are people who have experienced a death in their family who are evicted from their homes whilst they are in the process of sorry business. There are severe issues of overcrowding causing family unrest. Senior and respected members of our community are angry because their families are being forced to live in unacceptable and unsafe housing. We face discrimination on a daily basis because we're either treated like the token black fella or we're not black enough. There is community fatigue. Overly, people feel unheard. Some stay silent because they're tired from talking and then repeating themselves over and over and over without change. From the Aboriginal community-controlled organisations, we see local organisations and people with impressive experience who are struggling to obtain adequate funding to do the work that they need doing. We are seeing outside organisations coming into the ACT, getting huge sums of money to do the work that they really have no business doing. And with respect, this is another issue that we see replicated. The ACT is a very small jurisdiction. We should be leading by example. Contrary to popular belief, not all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people need assistance and live along other countrymen without any help at all. I'm going to read directly now from quotes from one of my colleagues in the Dhurrawang team. What's missing is a housing first approach and investment in public housing. Until someone in need is housed, everything in their life Sorry, I've lost my place. Is on hold. We see families living in cars or moving regularly between family and friends because a situation outside of their control has caused them to be homeless, which has led them to be unable to be rehoused because they don't have the history of being able to demonstrate the ability to sustain a tenancy. What this then results in is a spiral effect of not being able to hold down a job or attend network appointments, not being able to attend to their medical needs, their children not attending school, resulting in care and protection intervention. If a person or family is housed first, then the rest is worked out later. We might not see this spiral effect as often. And then, for Aboriginal people, it's more than just a house. A house is a home, it's a community, it's health, it's healing. The ability to be housed in appropriate, culturally safe houses improves an Aboriginal person's health and well-being, addressing the government's Close the Gap agenda. Aboriginal people, as traditional owners of this land, should be able to control their basic human right in having a safe and secure housing that is met. Again, for our clients, they don't need anything fancy. They just want a home and an adequate space that is safe and secure. They want hot water, a place to cook their meals, a yard for their kids to play in, things that shouldn't be so hard to get in the ACT. They don't want to be ringing their housing provider or engaging with lawyers to try and to have their rights enforced. And lastly, I'll bring you to my hat, which I've brought along to show you because it's beautiful. It was a gift, a recent gift to me from one of my clients who I've been assisting for about a year to have repairs undertaken at her home. When she first came to me in December last year and talked about her property and then proceeded in the days that followed to send me pictures of the conditions in which she was living, a very proud and neat woman with a young family, I was absolutely appalled. And you can imagine the fire in our bellies when we see how people are living and trying to do the right thing. I let her know that we don't usually undertake work in repairs area. We just give people advice and hope that they'll take that advice and have their property repaired. Sadly, that isn't the case. Fortunately, we have a principal solicitor who lets us run these cases in the ACAT because our client, needed a lawyer. I mean, it's a sad state of affairs, isn't it? That a mother who is doing all the right things, needs a lawyer to come in to have an oven that works, to have stable electricity, to have doors that lock and windows that close. I warned our client, that this wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't a quick fix. Even though it's not rocket science, we all know how to fix houses. It'd probably take a long time and a long drawn-out process. And here we are a year later, and I'm pleased to report that recently she was moved out of that property because it couldn't be repaired. It needed a new roof and amongst other things. But what's really sad is not only were this family living in this property in this condition for over 8 years, that our client's mental health really suffered through the process of trying to get her out and get the property repaired. And it's a toll that hurt us all. And so once she was rehoused, she came into the office almost a new person. She got some compensation because we used the Residential Tenancies Act in order to obtain that compensation. And she bought me this hat and some chocolates and perfume because she's so grateful for that assistance. The hat has a story on it, which is from her cousin, which I can't share with you, but it also has some emu feathers and echidna spikes, and also the quandong seeds, which, for those of you who don't know, and I didn't, is a drought-tolerant fruit, which is used to make lots of jams and spreads, but back in the traditional times it was used for toothache, so it might be something to keep in mind. But I'm very grateful to have the hat, but it is me who felt sad and wishing I could do more for her during this time. I don't feel like I did a good job, but we do the best that we can. The Residential Tenancies Act provides some limited protection for tenants, but the Human Rights Act also provides some protections which, as lawyers, we're enabled to make arguments in housing matters about human rights. And I think there are very few practitioners in the ACT who are practising in this area of law, and we will continue. We'll continue to fight for people's rights until we hopefully have a system that works a little bit better.
Very sobering to hear all of the problems here in the ACT. Now, we could ask a few more questions, but I'm conscious that we've been talking quite a bit about these important issues. And I just wanted to say, Rachel's just referred to the fact that we do have a right to privacy, which includes the right not to have your home arbitrarily interfered with. So there is a limited protection of the right to housing through that, but not in the sense of a positive right to housing for it to be fulfilled for everybody, to have that plan of action to make sure that everyone has a place to live that both Kevin and Devin in particular have talked about. But at this stage, I think we probably ought to hand over to our audience members to see if there are questions that you would like to ask the panel or perhaps comments that you'd like to make. So if I can just ask you, just identify yourself perhaps and a brief, pithy question either to one of the panel members or the whole panel. So I think, first of all, the gentleman in the middle, Ernst, thank you.
Thank you, and thank you to all the speakers for some very moving comments. I'd like to ask the speakers to explore what would be the implications of one of the important proposals that was put, and that is amendment of the Human Rights Act to include a right to housing. Now, it was put to us that there are two aspects of human rights. There's the negative and the positive. The right not to have the government take things away. And one could see that a right to housing could be used to protect people against unfair tenancy arrangements and so on. So it could have that significant impact. But what about the positive, the supply side? And this is the obvious difficulty with all the economic, social and cultural rights. We know that in Australia 60 or 70 years ago, public housing was a significant proportion of housing, and that has declined drastically. If there was a right to housing in the Human Rights Act, could that in some way be used to force government to provide more public housing? And if so, how would that be done? What sort of tribunal, what sort of criteria, bearing in mind that this is part of a government's budget? I do believe that in some countries, for example in India, social and cultural and economic rights have been enforced, but I'd be interested in the views of the panel on what would be the impact of inclusion of a right to housing in the Human Rights Act.
Thanks very much. Panellists, I'm looking very determinedly at Kevin. It's almost as though I planted you, Ernst, because of course this is a very pertinent question.
Sure, well I'm from out of town, so with that caveat I launch into an answer. But I did judicially administer the equivalent of the Human Rights Act in Victoria, so I have some knowledge of how it might work. And it would be a positive thing because it would legislate the right and elevate it to the point of being a right in Australian law, which would be very important. And I'd encourage that to be seriously considered on that ground alone. But the next thing is what impact would it have on the ground? And that would depend on the nature of the enforcement and accountability mechanism which was included along with the recognition of the right itself. the best way to bring about a result on the ground would be to not just recognise the right in law, but to include an obligation on government progressively to implement it, so that it would be then necessary to have a means of doing that. The best means of doing that would be to include in that obligation progressively to realise the right and obligation to have a plan formulated through public consultation with experts and people in civil society, such as those who are here, who clearly have a profound knowledge about where the needs are and where the rubber should hit the road in the first instance and what should happen in the longer run. So it depends. The answer to your question, sir, is that it depends. The right should be recognised, but exactly the impact that it has depends on the nature of the enforcement and accountability mechanism which is included. You've already heard how significant can be judicially in tribunals the obligation not to interfere arbitrarily with the right, because it arms human rights defenders such as those here with legal arguments which the court or the tribunal is obliged to listen to and enforce. It could be the same with respect to the right to housing through a plan. There could be some kind of legal, judicial type mechanism to supervise that. There are countries in the world where that happens, not just India, but many others. About 40 constitutions in the world include the right to housing and a serious role for constitutional courts in implementing the right to housing, including South Africa, but in many other places. In England and in Scotland, there is an enforceable right possessed by people who fall into homelessness to go to the local authority and demand to be housed, which, if not respected, can lead to a court proceeding whereby that right can be enforced. It's the same in France. So there are plenty of international precedents on which to draw to bring about the result, and I'm hopeful that these possibilities for ending these terrible problems that beset us through human rights mechanisms like this can be taken up.
Thanks very much, Kevin. Great comment from a judge. Always good to have a judge on a panel. Devin, did you want to add something?
Thank you. So apart from legal mechanisms, in terms of the social effects and economic effects, I think it would be quite remarkable, actually, because housing is the basis of a person's life. And when people aren't safely and securely housed, inevitably their other expenses increase and the state's expenses on their behalf increase, and their potential to contribute to the community is substantially diminished because, as we heard very eloquently, people are focused on where they're going to sleep safely that night, and so they can't be contributing to society in other ways. So, you know, my background's partly in epidemiology. It does not take many averted trips to the emergency room because someone is housed to pay for the cost of that housing. And similarly, from a mental health perspective, from a justice intervention perspective, the potential savings are pretty significant here. So for the part of our community that is not unreasonably focused on the government's bottom line, I would say that actually this represents an excellent investment. It's not the case that the savings, is obvious the next day. but there will be substantial savings and substantially increased productivity. We heard what a high proportion of people who are homeless are under the age of 24, and I would suggest that in assuring those people secure homes before the age of 24, we are setting them up for very different and more positive life trajectories. Thanks.
We have a question from Chris Klugman. Thank you.
Chris Klugman, Civil Liberties Australia. That there is a positive in the ACT. We do have a multi-party agreement to No Rights Without Remedy amendment to the Human Rights Act, and I'm sitting next to Helen Watchers. This is an amendment which enables people to take complaints about things like housing, first to the Human Rights Commission, and then if it's unable to be resolved there, to go to ACAT to have a judicial decision. Now this has the advantage of making sure the decisions are made about housing rights are made right in the first place. The point that you were making about upstream remedies stopping downstream costs. And this should stop the bureaucrat who's making a nasty decision to think twice, because there's somebody going to be evaluating his decision. No Rights Without Remedy is something that, again, the ACT, I think, is leading the jurisdictions in Australia. Thanks.
Could I just add to that? Bill Rawlings from Civil Liberties Australia. The key to this is a Federal Human Rights Act, and that the inclusion of homelessness as an issue is part of the Federal Human Rights Act that's being proposed by the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Human Rights and the Australian Human Rights Commission. Now, were that to get up by the mechanisms of reporting on financials and so on, where the money is doled out from the feds to the states and the territories, you can have a proper mechanism to make that enforceable through the Federal Human Rights Act. So what we really need, apart from just housing, is a Human Rights Act.
I'm sure most people on the panel would agree with you, Bill. And I guess the ACT has really led the way, and so it's important for us to keep innovating and adding to our act in the hope that the rest of the country will eventually catch up. I mean, there are some interesting issues about federalism that we haven't really touched on, and we've seen some movement at the federal level now with schemes to incentivise things like the help to buy or the build to rent schemes. But I did want to ask the panel perhaps to comment just on how that division of power and responsibility, and particularly the ability to raise revenue, impacts on housing as a right in Australia. Perhaps again, Kevin, if I throw to you on that.
Yeah, sure. Well, there are plenty of countries in the world which have federal political structures where the constitutional power to deliver a service or a public good rests with the province or the state, but the funding to enable that to happen rests with the central government. Germany is one. Canada is another obvious example. There are plenty of others. So Australia is not unique in distributing powers within the federal units of the Constitution. And it could easily be done in the case of housing, for housing to be recognised as a right in federal law in a way which took into account the Australian constitutional setting, which leaves the actual power for delivering housing in the hands of the state. The other possibility that could happen is there could be a referral up, as has happened in industrial relations. All the states have referred up the power to regulate employment to the federal government, and that's how employment is generally regulated in this country at the moment. That's another possibility. The really important, or one of the really important reasons why there should be a national approach to this, and that this political issue was worked through appropriately, is that there is a real need, in addition to individual complaint mechanisms, which have been rightly championed, by the ACT Commission in the past, to have a national systemic change, because there's a big difference between positive outcomes for individuals and transformational change in systems. And what we need, as I think must be obvious from this discussion, is a transformational change in the housing system. And the dimension of that change is truly historic. In terms of the future of Australia as a federation and as a country, what's needed is an historic shift in the way in which the system is organised, such that not tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands, but millions of people are assisted, because that's how big the problem is. And we have to, as much as it's a very good thing to celebrate 10 or 40 or 100,000 new dwellings, new housing outputs, far more important it is to recognise the dimension of the problem, which needs a wholly different system outcome over decades, progressively realised. And that can only happen through the kind of national change built on recognition of the right to housing, accompanied by national plans to implement it of the kind which involves the kind of expertise which you've heard evidenced in this room. The Constitution doesn't stand in the way of that. The Constitution enables that to happen, so there can be no legal reason against that happening. Any reason is political, and we're here debating the merits of that very question.
I think the chair has not chaired very well, because we're right up to time now, aren't we, at 2 o'clock? Are there any final questions from the audience? Yes, we've got a few. We've got John Stanhope to start off with, and then we've got another one. If people can stay for a few additional minutes, that'd be great.
Well, I am interested in how the right actually would play out in real terms. Noting, for instance, that in the last few years the ACT government sold off 1,288 units of public housing, mainly down Northbourne Avenue, and applied the entirety of the receipts for those sales to the light rail, and didn't replace the public housing. They then followed that up with the now infamous renewing public housing scheme, whereby they sought to evict 360 residents of public housing in order to be able to sell off the housing, because it was all in North Canberra and South Canberra, and most of the public housing was sitting on blocks of land worth more than $1 million. And the government thought that it would be a good idea to perhaps get their hands on that money, and I'm not sure what they intended to do in relation to the replacement of those housing. So in terms of a human right to housing, I'm interested in what is a government then to build up a supply or a stock? How is it going to actually determine how much public housing it needs in order to be able to meet, the rights of those people that are homeless and are looking for a house? Would it require the government to have a stock of housing in order to be able to meet its human rights obligations? Just coincidentally too, I am intrigued that today in Canberra there are fewer units of public housing and social housing than there were 10 years ago, when our population was 100,000 less than it is now. And I'm interested that sort of issue is not raised a little bit more regularly in terms of what it says about us as this wonderfully progressive community that we all know we are.
Thanks, John. Any takers from the panel?
Well, maybe a short answer. Well, firstly, I want to recognise your profound contribution to human rights in Australia, and thank you personally, because it's impacted my life both professionally and personally. One way that human rights would get into the area you're concerned about is that if there were to be sales of stock or any legislation which had the effect of impacting on the availability of housing, that would need to go through Parliament, and the Act would require a statement of compatibility to be prepared with respect to that legislation. That would enliven a significant policy discussion about the impact of the legislation which wouldn't otherwise happen. So that's just one way. But it's too late to go on, I think.
Having a plan as, you know, an immediately realisable or a step that needs to be taken, I think would be significant. It's, you know, it's that simple, that they've got to have developed a plan, and as Kevin said, it's got to include consultation with the community and with experts. I don't know if Devin or Kellie, you looked as though you were about to launch into...
Bit antsy, don't I? Sorry. I think I would like to address the politicians we do have in the room and people of VIPs. And I'm going to be coming from the context of my own experience as a volunteer for frontline service. As a frontline service of OrangeSky, for example, I do laundry and talk with those on the street. When we talk about providing units of public housing, etc., don't we need to address this issue first of the homeless, organising mental health for help for them, rehab for them? There's no rehab places to go to. There's no mental health wards that will take you for more than 3 days. 3 days. Yeah, sure, you're right, off you go. Nah, doesn't work. And it's not working. It hasn't worked for decades and decades. I'm lucky to still be here, seriously, really lucky. I should be 6 foot under, and I'm not, for a reason, obviously. Into the Act, somehow, I don't know, I'm not a policy maker, I don't claim to be. Should there be some way we can guarantee a realistic influx of guaranteed money thrown at frontline services? They have the infrastructure, they have the skills, they have the connections, they have the trust of those already out there on the street. If you have someone who's not in a Salvo's uniform coming up to you on the street, you immediately are wary of them. I just wanted to bring that up. I really need to put that out there and say, please, could we just, why are we fundraising every year ourselves? We're having to have Lamington drives to raise money to get people off the street. Really? Really? So, yeah, thank you again for that. Thank you.
Devin, any quick thoughts?
I think there absolutely is a minimum amount of public housing that is required. It could almost certainly be augmented by some proportion of community housing, noting that they have slightly different roles. Community housing may be, in some instances, better placed to provide the kind of wraparound mental health or AOD supports that you were just talking about. But absolutely there is a minimum amount, and we've gone too low.
And coming back to these sort of interesting questions about how much you need to provide and how much is it about not having something that you're being deprived of, it's been said when we're looking at the right to housing, the experts at the UN level have said any country in which there are substantial numbers of homeless people is prima facie in violation of the right to housing. It's seen as one of the core elements of the right to housing. We're doing something wrong, and that's why we need a plan of action to try and resolve that issue. Okay, lots of hands now going up. How long have we got the room? Can I go for another 10 minutes, do you think? And if you do need to leave, please do, but we've got lots of hands. There was one up here. Please, go ahead.
Good afternoon. My name is Hadi Zahir. I'm from the Justice and Community Safety Directorate. Thank you to everyone on the panel, esteemed guests, for your sharing your experiences and opinions with us. My question is a little bit about what Rachael earlier referred to as replication nation. Particularly at a federal level, we seem to go through the same debate cycle every election, and then big promises are made, and then we just fall that short of big policy changes, whether it's around debate around negative gearing or the fundamental issue of how an entire generation now feels very disenfranchised when it comes to issues such very fundamental such as housing, to the extent that that frustration is now translating into political anger on a whole lot of other issues because an entire generation is coming up feeling disenfranchised. My question to the panel, to really anyone, is how to go about building that political momentum or societal momentum so that it eventually goes to translate into actual change on a policy front rather than going through the same debate election in, election out. Thank you.
Great question. Are there any thoughts from the panel? And then I'd better stop being a terrible chair and to draw proceedings to a close, I think.
I'll take a stab. Yep. Short of taking up politics myself, which I don't want to do, then there is a public housing waiting list for a start. So we know the number of people who are waiting to be housed, and there are presumably community housing waiting lists that are... we're not talking about needing millions of houses in this jurisdiction. It's a very small number. And if I can overly simplify the economics, diverting money from the intended rail or the jail, extending that, would easily cover the properties that we need. Now, we know there's been all the issues of the past, but this is not a huge problem to resolve. It's not rocket science. They're just houses, and we need more of them. And so we need leaders who are fearless and deliberate. And I know this is an adversarial system of law, but all the parties and politicians, I think they'd agree that to propel this forward and for someone to stand up and that has access to the bank account, and I don't know who that is, to do something. That it's not hard. And I think we're all on board. Nobody wants to see homeless people anywhere. So I think I've overly simplified the issues, but yeah. In addition to the public housing, I'll just throw in that I've been trying to build a house for 4 years, and apart from the delays from the planning, the government's planning section, which have amounted to 18 months, there's been supply issues, there was a pandemic, there's been a couple of wars. So many things have happened, and the ACT government has thrown us a fine for not finishing on time and want to know how come we haven't. And I did write a pretty cute email listing all the world problems and was told, well, that didn't happen since you ran out of time. But I believe lately, in this housing crisis, that this same government department closed their applications for housing new builds on the 1st of November this year. So in amongst our housing disaster, as Kevin calls it, we've got a government who is closing applications for new properties to be built. I mean, that's ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous that someone cannot put in an application to build a house right now, but they can't. I think applications might open again towards the end of January, and I'm sorry if I'm offending someone, but this is affecting people's lives. So that's my 2 bobs worth. I told you I wasn't backward in getting on the soapbox if the opportunity arose, so don't say you weren't warned.
Excellent. I'm going to throw to Devin for the very lucky last comment, and then we'll have to close.
One thing that I'd just like to leave you with is that while it can feel like we're not making the progress we want, I think it's really clear that at different levels of government, some elections have resulted in better outcomes than others. And so my final thought is that change really is possible. And the more we as a group are public in our advocacy and intelligent in our advocacy to decision makers who get elected to both levels of government, the more we can expect to see positive movement.
Great note to end on. Thanks, everyone. For listening so intently, and I'm sorry to other people who just started to get into the groove of asking questions, but hopefully over the refreshments that are out there you can continue the conversation. Thanks so much for coming, great to see everyone, and we'll close now.